The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
There are men who chase the spotlight, and there are men who build it, polish it, aim it at someone else, and then quietly step back into the dark. Benny Andersson has always belonged to the second kind. For more than 50 years, the world has hummed his melodies without ever really knowing the man who wrote them. Now, at 78, something has shifted. The old caution, the practiced modesty, the careful Swedish reserve, it's softening. And what's emerging from behind it looks a lot like the story fans have quietly suspected for decades. Not a scandal, not a tabloid confession. Something quieter and, in its own way, far more devastating. The truth about what it actually cost to make the happiest sounding music in the world. Long before four Swedes in sequin jumpsuits became a global phenomenon, there was a boy in Vällingby with an accordion strapped to his chest, more comfortable with chords than conversation. Benny Andersson didn't grow up dreaming of stadiums. He grew up in a working-class Stockholm suburb, raised in a home where music was less a hobby than a shared language, passed down from his grandfather and father, both amateur musicians who filled the house with folk tunes and hymns. By his teens, Benny was playing in dance bands, absorbing everything from Swedish Schlager to the American rock and roll trickling into Europe. What made Benny different from the start wasn't ambition. It was attentiveness. Bandmates from his early years in the Hep Stars, the group that made him a teen idol in Sweden years before ABBA existed. Remember a young man who listened more than he talked, who could sit at a piano for hours chasing a single chord change while everyone else had long since gone home. That habit never left him. It became, in many ways, the entire architecture of ABBA's sound, a willingness to sit inside a feeling until it resolved itself. When Benny met Björn Ulvaeus in 1966, something clicked that neither of them fully understood at the time. They weren't just two songwriters who got along. They were two very different processors of emotion who happened to fit together. Björn brought structure, language, the discipline of storytelling. Benny brought instinct, texture, the parts of a song you feel before you can explain. Together, they discovered they could build something neither could build alone. Music that sounded effortless but was, underneath, meticulously engineered to move people. It's worth remembering that ABBA didn't happen by accident. Benny was, by every account from those who worked alongside him at Polar Studios, relentless in the pursuit of a specific emotional target. He wasn't chasing hits in the way people assume, chasing charts, chasing radio play. He was chasing a very particular ache, the kind of bittersweetness that made Dancing Queen feel joyful and melancholy in the same breath, the kind of tension that made SOS sound like a party and a plea at once. That contrast wasn't a happy accident of pop songwriting. It was Benny's signature, built note by note in a control room, while the world outside imagined for glamorous stars, simply having fun. Those who watched him work in those early years describe a musician almost stubborn in his patience. He would return to the same 8 bars for hours, discarding chord after chord, until one finally matched something he couldn't yet name out loud. It wasn't about achieving technical polish. It was about honesty of feeling, a standard so exacting that even his closest collaborators sometimes struggled to understand what he was chasing until the finished track played back and the reason became obvious. This instinct, more than any single melody, is what separated ABBA's catalog from the disposable pop of its era. Benny wasn't writing songs meant to fade after a season on the radio. He was building structures meant to hold up decades later. And somehow, almost impossibly, they did. Here's the part of ABBA's story that rarely gets told with any real weight. While Agnetha Faltskog and Annie Frida Lyngstad became the faces the world fell in love with, Benny spent most of his career on the other side of the glass. Photographs from the era tell the story better than words. Agnetha and Frida in the foreground, catching the light, and Benny slightly behind, headphones on, eyes on the mixing desk. He wasn't hiding exactly. He was working, but over years, that positioning hardened into something like an identity. The world decided who Benny was before Benny had much say in it. The quiet one, the technical one, the guy behind the piano. People close to the group have long suggested that this framing bothered Benny more than he let on. Not because he wanted the fame the women received. Those who know him describe someone genuinely uncomfortable with excessive attention, but because the framing flattened him. It reduced a man who was pouring enormous emotional effort into every arrangement down to a kind of technician, a craftsman assembling parts, rather than an artist bleeding onto the keys. There's a particular kind of loneliness in creating the emotional core of songs that make millions of people cry, and then watching the world credit that emotion entirely to the voices singing it. Benny also carried a role inside ABBA that nobody put on a job title. He was frequently the one holding things together when tension rose. For intensely creative, increasingly famous people under constant pressure will inevitably clash, and by most accounts, Benny often became the de facto mediator, smoothing arguments in the studio, absorbing friction so the work could continue. It's a role that looks invisible from the outside and feels exhausting from the inside. Being the group's stabilizer meant Benny rarely got the space to be destabilized himself. Somebody had to be steady. It was usually him. And yet, without him, ABBA simply doesn't happen the way it did. Bjorn's lyrics needed Benny's chord progressions to carry their weight. The signature ABBA sound, bright melodies laid over minor key undercurrents, joy shadowed by something sadder just beneath, was Benny's doing almost entirely. He was one of the first pop songwriters of his generation to fully embrace multitrack layering and early synthesizers, building dense, cinematic productions at a time when most groups were still recording relatively simple arrangements. Producers who worked at Polar Studios in the 70s have described Benny's sessions as unusually exacting. Hours spent on a single vocal harmony stack, entire days lost chasing the right texture on a synth pad. It wasn't perfectionism for its own sake. It was a man trying to get a feeling exactly right, because the feeling was the whole point. What also set Benny apart was his understanding of restraint. He knew, instinctively, when a song needed silence more than sound, when to strip an arrangement back to almost nothing so a single vocal line could carry the entire emotional weight of a track. That kind of control is rarely celebrated the way a soaring chorus is, but it's often what separates a song people enjoy from a song people remember for a lifetime. Benny's fingerprints are all over the empty spaces in ABBA's catalog as much as the crowded ones, and that balance, more than any single hook, is part of why the songs still hold up on the radio today. Benny's relationship with Frida is one of the more quietly complicated threads in ABBA's history, and it deserves to be told without the tabloid gloss it's often given. Their bond began, fittingly, in music, a professional collaboration that slowly became something more personal, built less on grand romantic gestures and more on the strange intimacy of working closely with someone who understands your creative language. For two people who found emotional expression difficult in ordinary conversation, the studio became a kind of safe ground, a place where feelings could be communicated through a bridge or a bass line instead of a difficult conversation. But what worked in the studio didn't always translate outside it. Frida has spoken over the years about carrying her own early wounds, a childhood marked by displacement and loss, and about needing real emotional presence from the people close to her. Benny, by his own later reflections, has acknowledged that he wasn't always able to offer that. He processed the world through composition. When the music stopped, so often did his ability to reach out. It's a pattern many creative people recognize in themselves. Total fluency in a chosen craft, and a strange wordlessness everywhere else. This is part of what makes songs like The Winner Takes It All and One of Us land so hard decades later. They weren't written as distant commentary on someone else's heartbreak. They came out of a relationship that was, by most accounts, unraveling in real time, with two of the very people living it standing in the same room, turning it into art before either had fully processed it as life. Frida sang those songs with an intensity that suggested she meant every word. Benny, meanwhile, has hinted in later interviews that writing those melodies may have been easier than actually sitting down and having the harder conversations they were quietly avoiding. None of this is really about blame. It's about a very human pattern. Two people who loved each other through the medium they were best at, and who struggled when that medium wasn't available. Benny's more recent reflections on this period suggest a kind of gentle regret, not for the music, which he stands by completely, but for the moments outside the music where presence might have mattered more than another beautiful bridge. It's tempting, looking back, to frame their story as a simple case of incompatible personalities, one loud, one quiet, doomed from the start. But those who watch them work together closely have often pushed back on that reading. What made the relationship difficult wasn't a lack of connection. It was two people who connected almost too easily in one specific channel and struggled everywhere else. The very thing that made their creative partnership so powerful, an ability to translate raw feeling directly into sound, may have also been the thing that made ordinary emotional life harder to sustain. It's a paradox that shows up again and again in stories of artistic partnerships, and Benny and Frida's version of it happens to have been set to some of the most recognizable music ever recorded. For decades, the public conversation around ABBA's internal tensions focused almost entirely on Agnetha and Frida, who was the real star, whose voice carried the group, who got more attention in the press. It made for an easy narrative, but those who spent real time around the band have often pointed to a different, quieter tension: Benny's complicated relationship with visibility itself. It wasn't a rivalry with the women. It was something closer to an ongoing negotiation with how the world chose to see him. Magazine covers featured Agnetha and Frida. Interviews leaned toward personal lives, fashion, romance. Benny and Bjorn were filed under the songwriters, respected, but rarely explored with the same curiosity. For a man who was, by every internal account, obsessive about the emotional architecture of every track, being reduced to a technical footnote carried its own quiet sting. Some who worked closely with ABBA in that era have described Benny as being unfairly cast as the group's cold or purely analytical mind, the guy who handled the mechanics while others handled the feeling. It's an easy label to apply to someone who prefers a mixing desk to a magazine spread, but it's also, by most accounts, deeply inaccurate. The emotional complexity baked into ABBA's biggest hits didn't arrive by technical accident. It came from a man translating things he struggled to say aloud into things he could say through a chord change. As the years passed and ABBA's fame calcified into legend, Benny largely stopped trying to correct the narrative. He redirected his energy into new work, film scores, theater compositions, projects where authorship was less contested and emotional labor was, at least, properly attributed. But those who know him well suggest the old imbalance never fully disappeared. It simply stopped being something he fought about out loud. There's a version of this story where Benny comes across as bitter, but that's not quite accurate either. What emerges more clearly from his later reflections is something closer to weariness, the exhaustion of being consistently misread by an industry that preferred simple categories to complicated truths. He wasn't asking to trade places with Agnetha or Frida, and he's never suggested otherwise. What he seems to have wanted all along was simply to be understood as a full person rather than a function, a craftsman whose work happened to require enormous emotional investment even when nobody was watching him do it. ABBA's split in the early 80s has been mythologized as many things: a casualty of the members' failed marriages, a victim of changing musical tastes, a band that simply ran its course. The truth, according to those closest to it, was less dramatic and somehow sadder. The group didn't explode, it dimmed. Touring had become exhausting. The pressure to keep producing hits at the level of Dancing Queen or Mamma Mia had turned creation into obligation. And for Benny specifically, something more personal had happened. The music had stopped feeling like discovery and started feeling like duty. He has since suggested that by the final years of ABBA, what kept him showing up wasn't excitement about the work, but a sense of responsibility to the people counting on the group's continued success: bandmates, crew, an entire machine built around 4 Swedes who'd become a global institution. There was no dramatic blow-up, no defining conversation where the band formally called it quits. It simply faded, the way certain things do when nobody has the language to name what's ending. Frida, by most accounts, had already begun emotionally stepping away before the official split, having made her peace with the ending earlier than the others. Benny's own reckoning took considerably longer. He suggested in later years that it took him the better part of a decade to fully understand how much the end of ABBA had affected him. Not the loss of fame, which he never seemed particularly attached to, but the loss of a shared creative language he'd spent his most formative years building with 3 other people. What makes this chapter of the story so striking is how undramatic it was in real time. There was no single headline, no defining photograph of the band's last day together. The end of ABBA arrived the way most real endings do, not as an event but as an accumulation, a slow recognition that something which used to feel alive no longer did. Benny has described the strange sensation of realizing, only in hindsight, that certain sessions in the final years carried an unspoken heaviness nobody addressed directly. Everyone could feel it. Nobody named it. And so the band simply stopped, quietly. The way a conversation trails off when both people already know what's coming. What Benny did after ABBA says perhaps more about him than anything he did during it. He didn't chase a solo pop career or try to replicate past success. He turned toward musical theater, composing for productions like Chess and later Christina Fran de Vemela, work that allowed him to explore darker, more layered emotional territory than pop radio ever could. Colleagues from this era describe someone finally working without the noise of global fame pressing in, freer, more exploratory, willing to sit with difficult material for as long as it needed. This period functioned, in many ways, as a kind of quiet reckoning. Away from the machinery of ABBA, Benny had room to process things he hadn't fully processed while living them. The intensity of those years, the relationships strained by fame, the version of himself that had been built more for public consumption than personal honesty. He's spoken, in scattered interviews across the decades, about beginning to understand only much later just how much of himself he'd left unexamined during ABBA's peak. In more recent years, Benny has taken on something like a mentorship role within Scandinavian music circles, quietly guiding younger composers, not just in craft, but in the emotional discipline that craft demands. Those who've worked with him in this capacity describe a man far more open than his old reputation suggests, reflective, generous with his time, willing to talk honestly about the toll creative work can take on the people making it. There's a certain symmetry in how Benny's later career unfolded. The boy who once sat alone at a piano for hours, chasing a feeling nobody else could hear yet, grew into an old man doing something remarkably similar. Except now he was helping other young musicians learn to trust that same instinct in themselves. Those who have studied under him describe a teacher unusually attentive to emotional truth over technical correctness, someone who cares less about whether a chord is theoretically justified and more about whether it actually communicates what the composer is trying to say. It's a philosophy that traces directly back to the habits he built as a teenager, decades before the world had any idea who he would become. At 78, Benny Andersson isn't interested in rewriting ABBA's story into something cleaner or more comfortable. If anything, his more recent reflections point toward the opposite instinct, a willingness, finally, to let the story be as complicated as it actually was. Not a fairy tale about four perfect pop stars who conquered the world effortlessly, but a far more human account of four flawed, exhausted, deeply feeling people who built something extraordinary partly because of their fragility, not in spite of it. This is, in the end, what fans have quietly sensed for years without ever quite hearing confirmed, that the sadness under ABBA's brightest songs wasn't a production trick. It was real. The joy audiences heard in Dancing Queen, and the ache buried in The Winner Takes It All, came from the same source. For people trying to hold themselves together through the only language some of them fully trusted. Benny, more than perhaps anyone in the group, used that language as both a gift to the world and a shield for himself. Looking back now, with the kind of distance only decades can provide, Benny seems to understand something he likely couldn't have articulated in ABBA's prime, that the band's genius and its fragility were never separate things. They were the same thing, viewed from different angles. The perfectionism, the emotional distance, the endless hours chasing one more harmony. All of it came from the same place. A man who found it easier to be understood through music than through conversation. That's the quiet truth, sitting underneath the glitter and the platform boots and the Eurovision trophy. ABBA wasn't a perfect pop machine. It was four people, imperfect and human, who happened to be extraordinary enough to turn their struggles into something the whole world could dance to. And now, in his late 70s, Benny Andersson finally seems at peace letting that fuller, messier, more honest story be told, not as an apology for what ABBA was, but as a long overdue acknowledgement of what it actually took to make it. Perhaps that's the real reason this story still resonates decades later. It was never really about four glamorous Swedes conquering the pop charts. It was about the universal, unglamorous work of trying to hold yourself together while the world watches, and finding, almost by accident, that the effort itself could be turned into something beautiful enough to outlast every one of the people who made it. Benny Andersson spent a lifetime translating that struggle into sound. Now, finally, he seems willing to translate it into words as well. It would be easy to treat all of this as simple nostalgia, another look back at a band that peaked nearly half a century ago. But what makes Benny's more recent openness genuinely significant isn't the history itself. It's what that history reveals about the price of making something timeless. Audiences tend to assume that the artists behind their favorite songs experience the same joy listeners feel when the music plays. Benny's story complicates that assumption in a way that feels almost necessary. Genuine art, the kind that survives generations, often comes from people working through something difficult in real time, and ABBA's catalog turns out to be no exception, no matter how bright the production or how danceable the chorus. There's also something instructive in how long it took Benny to arrive at this level of honesty. He didn't emerge from ABBA's dissolution with immediate clarity about what the band had cost him personally. That understanding came slowly, over decades, through theater work, through mentoring, through the ordinary passage of time that eventually strips away the noise and leaves only what actually mattered. It's a reminder that self-understanding rarely arrives on schedule, even for people whose entire career depended on understanding emotion well enough to compose it for others. What's striking, too, is how little Benny's reflections resemble the confessions the public often expects from aging celebrities. There's no scandal being unveiled, no long-hidden feud finally settled. Instead, what emerges is something quieter and, in some ways, harder to package into a headline. An acknowledgement that four talented, driven people built something extraordinary while simultaneously struggling to hold their own lives together, and that these two facts were never separate from each other. The brilliance and the difficulty came from the same source. You cannot fully credit one without acknowledging the other. This also reframes how fans might listen to ABBA's music going forward. Songs that once seemed like straightforward pop confections reveal new layers once you understand the emotional context behind them. Dancing Queen becomes not just a celebration, but a portrait of joy deliberately built to counterbalance something heavier underneath. The Winner Takes It All stops sounding like a clean, dramatic breakup ballad and starts sounding like something closer to a private conversation two people never quite managed to have in real life, set instead to a melody precise enough to say what words alone couldn't. Once you know what went into the songs, you can't quite hear them the same way again, and that's not a loss. If anything, it's a deeper form of appreciation, one rooted not in spectacle, but in genuine understanding of the people who made the music possible. Benny's later life honesty also offers something valuable beyond ABBA's specific story. It's a case study in what happens when enormous public success collides with private emotional struggle, and how those two forces can coexist for years without either one canceling out the other. The band's global fame was real. The personal cost was also real. Neither fact diminishes the other, and Benny's willingness, at 78, to hold both truths at once says something meaningful about what it takes to eventually make peace with a complicated past. In the end, what Benny Andersson offers now isn't a scandal or a bombshell revelation designed to generate headlines. It's something rare, an honest accounting from a man who spent most of his life speaking through music because ordinary words felt too risky, finally finding the words anyway, decades later, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to protect. That, more than any chart position or awards tally, might be the most fitting final chapter to a story that was always more human than the glitter ever let on. For millions of fans who grew up singing along without ever thinking too hard about who was standing quietly behind the piano, this later chapter offers something valuable. Permission to see ABBA not as a flawless fantasy, but as four ordinary people who happen to make extraordinary things while quietly struggling, the same way most of us do. Benny's story isn't really an ending. It's an invitation to listen again, this time with open eyes and a little more patience, and finally hear everything that was always quietly waiting there beneath the melody, present all along, simply unheard until right now.